All right, so I'm going to try to talk about DataMapper in 20 minutes, which is really, really hard because you saw the presentation just about one adapter took about half an hour. Basically, DataMapper is now part of the Merb stack. So as we said, the Merb stack is like this bundled version of different gems that are part of Merb. So we just want to introduce that to you. You need to realize that with Merb, you can choose whichever ORM you want, and we will have a presentation after this one about SQL. I think most of you guys know ActiveRecord that comes with Rails. So you don't have to use DataMapper. It's just that not everybody knows that DataMapper, so we want to present it. All right. So let's just quickly introduce myself. My name is Matt Aimonetti. I'm a consultant here in San Diego, California. I blog on two main blogs. One is Merbists.com, which I started not long ago, and the other one is Rails on the Run. I'm working a lot on Merb when I have some free time, also contribute to DataMapper. I've been doing a lot in the Ruby community for a while. But today I really want to focus on DataMapper, which is an object relational mapper. So I just want to explain what it is because I'm going to talk about ORM, we're going to talk about ORM, but we don't always know what that really means. I mean, if you just started developing with Rails, you might not have realized that one of the cool stuff when you use Ruby is the ORM. In Merb, we really push the ORM in the front end because we let you choose the one you want. So let's just try to explain what an ORM is very simply. An ORM is just a way of converting data between an RDBMS, or a database system, and an object-oriented programming language. So in a database, usually we have scalar values that are fixed, and you know how to use a database, so you know the kind of data you have in the database. On the other side, when you write any type of program using objects, so when it's an object-oriented language, you don't use this type of scalar values. You use real objects. And the ORM's goal is to actually convert data back and forth between these two different worlds. One big advantage of using an ORM is that you avoid writing raw SQL. You don't need to do that anymore. The reason why you don't want to do that is not that SQL sucks. Well, it kind of does, but that's not the point here. The point is, if you write some sort of SQL against one type of database, it's not going to be compatible with another type of database. So if you use, for instance, let's say a Postgres SQL, you might have something specific to Postgres that's not going to work on MySQL or vice versa. So really, you would like the ORM to take care of that, and you don't want to write SQL because, yes, it does suck. So instead, what we want to do is really write pure Ruby. That would be cool because we're Ruby guys, we're cool, we like sexy stuff, we like Ruby because it's sexy, so we want to write sexy queries. Sorry, awesome queries. So that's the main goal of the ORM, and that's what DataMapper does for you. Now, ActiveRecord also does that for you. But here's an example that we use a lot, especially when you use, well, actually, that's ActiveRecord. When you want to have a condition, here we need to put some sort of raw SQL in the middle of my Ruby, which is kind of, I feel like I'm violating something. There's like some sort of Ruby raping going on. And it's not that great. And on top of that, the other issue that you have with that is that here, because it's SQL, it might not be compatible with different type of databases. So the statement I'm putting here might actually fail me if I change database. So really what we want to do is to have an ORM that will just take Ruby. And DataMapper does that, but really it does more than that. So what I want to do is not try to compare different type of ORMs, because I think the three ORMs you can use with Merb are really great, but they do different things. And I just want to show you why I like DataMapper and what it does that I think is cool. So the first example is the identity map. The identity map is a concept that's at the core of DataMapper. And here's a quick snippet. It's just some tests you can run if you have ActiveRecord. If you have DataMapper, the find is slightly different unless you use a plugin to have the same type of find as ActiveRecord. But basically what we do is we get a parent by its name, and then the parent has a relationship with children, so he has many children, and we're going to loop through the children, and we're going to look at the object ID of the parent that we had before, and we're going to compare it through the association, and we're going to make sure that the two object IDs are the same. The problem is that with ActiveRecord, this is going to fail. It's going to return false. However, with DataMapper, what we want to do is we want to assign one row in the database to one object reference in memory. And that's a very, very important concept, because if you do that, now you're going to run way faster, because you're not going to have to recreate a new object all the time. And if you don't recreate a new object, you also save a lot of resource in your system. The other advantage of doing something like that is if you do two gets at the same time on the same object, on the same resource, and you modify one, with ActiveRecord, it won't stay in sync. But because we have the same object in the memory with DataMapper, it's going to stay in sync. Did I just say DataMapper twice? Maybe. So I'll just say that again. If you queried the same object twice, and you do it with ActiveRecord, you're going to get two object ID. If you modify one, the second one is not in sync anymore. However, if you do that with DataMapper, because you only use one object, if you modify it, you will stay in sync. So it's going to end up being faster and more reliable. So just to quickly close this parenthesis between ActiveRecord and DataMapper, they do the same thing, but they do it differently. And the key reason why they do it differently comes from data objects. And data object is a very cool concept and implementation itself. So what happens is if you use ActiveRecord, you have a lot of different drivers. So you have a driver for MySQL, you have a driver for SQLite, you have guys who wrote a driver for Oracle, one for Postgres, and they'll all have different type of APIs. So ActiveRecord needs to be smart enough to figure out what's going on, how to talk to all these drivers, and it makes it a bit more complicated. In the case of DataMapper, the guys decided that we need to have something in the middle that we're going to call a unified front or unified interface that will interface between any type of drivers and DataMapper. So DataMapper will always talk the same way using the same methods to any type of drivers. So drivers were rewritten in C to be faster, and right now we have MySQL drivers, SQLite drivers, and Postgres drivers. And they will talk through the data object interface, and they will accept the same type of comments. What that permits to do is that DataMapper will stay very simple, use a set of different comments, and let me show you. I don't know how I'm going to use this laser stuff. But basically, the DataMapper, I guess I can't do that. I'm not smart enough. It's all right. So the DataMapper layer is what's going on in DataMapper itself. Everything else is on the adapter aspect of things. So because it's so simple, you can actually write you an adapter, and you don't have to use one of these guys. And you can actually you can just go and access a different type of data store. A cool example of why a very nice unified interface is nice is what Fiverr did. I don't know if you guys heard this morning, but they just released a tune-up for Merb and for DataMapper. What is really cool is that the implementation is very, very simple. What they did is they just came in the middle, just after DataMapper, before the adapter, and they just use I'm not going to get into the implementation, but it's really nice. I would go and get up and look at it if I were you. But they just use this implementation to see what's going on and to give you a report on the queries that were sent, all the information that you get. And because they have a unified front, they can really deal with that in a very nice way. Another aspect of DataMapper is that you have lazy loading and strategic eager loader. So that's a lot of big words. I don't really like big words. Basically what that means is that DataMapper likes procrastinations. So if procrastination is good, what that means is it's going to wait for a type of what we call a query, a kicker method. So when you write all your Ruby code, and you say, for instance, get me all the different resources, it's not going to do that until the last minute. It's like your homework when you're a student. You're going to wait the last minute. And DataMapper does the same thing. And when it would get one of this enumerable method, which comes from the enumerable class, so any of that, or when you ask for an attribute on a special object, then it's going to trigger the query. The great advantage of doing that is this simple example. Let's say I want to get all the zoos, and then for each zoo, I want to get all the exhibits. So we have a relationship between zoo who has many exhibits. And for each exhibit that a zoo has, I want to print the name. Okay? If I do that in a different ORM like ActiveRecord, I'm going to get that. I'm going to get select all from zoos, and then for each single exhibit I have, it's going to create a query. So that's kind of the n+1 situation we all know and we don't really like. For queries, if let's say I had 150 exhibits, that would probably be pretty painful. The way DataMapper does it is, since it waits until the last minute, he actually can understand what you're trying to do, and he will do something like that, 2 queries. Does one to get all the zoos, and then he will do a simple query with an in inside, and you get all the objects. So that's 2 queries instead of whatever number you would have. So we forget about the n+1. So that's really cool. We call that SEL, Strategic Eagle Loader. That's really nice. Something else that's nice on the database is that you have lazy loading. So lazy loading, I'm not going to go too much into that, but basically if you have fields that are big, for instance, by default, if you have a text type field in your database, it's not going to query it until you need it. You can also set different type of fields that you don't really need, and you say, okay, this one should be lazy loaded. So unless I need them, the database will not send them back to me. And you can even package them so you can have like a group of different attributes you want to get at the same time. But it's pretty cool. It would really save you time on the database, but that's not one of the main advantages for me. What I really like with DataMapper is multiple repos. And we just covered that a little bit with CouchDB. But here's an example. It might not be a great example, but it's a good example to show you what you can do with multiple repos. So in my database.yaml, in my Merb application, I defined 3 repos inside my production app. I have a first repo, which is going to be my default repo, which is a MySQL. It could be a Postgres or whatever type of adapter I want to use. And that's going to be my main database that my application is going to use. But on top of that, I'm going to set up 2 other repos, one for my nightly backups, and that's just an SQLite 3, and then for my weekly backup. So here, guys, the concept is not to say, oh, you could just do an SQL dump and do the backup, right? It's just to show you that you can convert data between 2 types of repos. Once you set up that, the only thing you need to do is that. And that's pretty sexy to me, and that's really awesome. You can just do article copy, and you copy from one type repo that has a specific adapter to another one based on conditions. So that's pretty cool. You can set any type of query you want. It won't be super fast, and that's not the point. But what it does is that it will convert from one type repo to the other. So if I had, let's say, MySQL on one end, and on the other end, I had Postgres, it will take my object and convert them. In this case, what it will do is it will take my main database and take all the new objects and dump them into my daily, weekly backup, my nightly backup. But because it's not super fast, what you might want to do, well, hold on, there's something else I should say. You could also do that if you have a different type of adapter. For instance, Yehuda wrote a Salesforce adapter. So it will have all this information on Salesforce, and his repo will access this information. You could just copy all this information from the Salesforce adapter and dump that into your MySQL database or Postgres database based on conditions. You could also, because it's not super fast, if you want to have incremental type of database, we could just do copy from one repo to the other that was already copied from the main one. And you can put different type conditions. So that's a feature that I think is very, very useful that I don't find with other ORMs. Another reason why I like and use DataMapper is when you have to deal with legacy applications, and especially legacy data. So that's the example of a model. I wrote a new app. Let's just imagine I wrote this new app in Merb. And I have this old PHP app that still has all the database in the old schema database. And it's just, the fields were not called the proper way. The IDs were not right. You have all these different settings. But I don't want to convert all my data because we still use the old database. So what you can do is you can define one model. And inside this model, you define how the properties are mapped in different repositories. So I can say in my new repo, in my new database, if I want to access the name, I have this type of property. But if you want to access the same property on my object in the old database, then you need to look at the field called title. And now you just need to say which repo you're accessing, and you'll get the same object back, which, once again, I think is pretty awesome. One more thing we quickly talked about are adapters. Adapters are, if we go back to the beginning, if you remember, we had DataMapper, and then we had like different methods, that you had data objects, and then you had SQL drivers. Well, we don't always want to deal with SQL type queries, right? We don't always want to deal with data stores that are databases. Sometimes you just want to access an API, maybe Flickr, maybe Google Video, whatever you want to access, Salesforce, or your file system, or whatever. Well, the adapter will let you connect to the DataMapper itself and access the information the way you want using the same type of interface. And we already have a bunch of adapters out there. So we have an IMAP adapter, a file system, Salesforce, REST, CouchDB, Ferret. And I even wrote one just for this demo. I tried to actually plug in DataMapper with an HTTP scraper. So Google Video doesn't have an API right now. So if you want to like get your own videos, you cannot do that. And I tried to do that. I was like, well, if DataMapper offers me a nice interface for my adapters, I should be able to do it. And I actually was able to do it in 80 lines of code. And I was very, very impressed because my adapter is only a read-only. I'm not going to post any type of videos to Google Video directly. I just had to implement one method, which was a read method, and that was then used with two different conditions if you do a read one or read many. And I had to handle the different conditions that needed to map my HTTP scraper. But if you go to my repo on GitHub, you can actually see this adapter. And that 80 lines of code is very, very impressive. And I'm sure you can even do it in less, but I don't really see the point. Now, mine is just a read-only adapter. Yehuda wrote a Salesforce adapter, which is a read and write adapter. So you can do like user.save, and it will actually push it back to Salesforce. And he wrote in 200 lines of code. This adapter on top of that is used in production already. And actually, Yehuda was telling me that he actually trusts his own adapter better than some of the DO adapters that we have because he knows it's pretty good. But 200 lines of code to write a custom adapter for an API, that's pretty impressive. And what you also gain is that the developers are going to use your application. They know how to use DataMapper. It's the same type of queries that they use for their own database. So they don't need to relearn a new API and say, okay, I need to do this type of method if I want this object. No, it's exactly the same thing. A question that comes often about DataMapper, and I want to clear right away, is migrations. So people tell me, well, but DataMapper doesn't do migration. Well, yes, it does. It's true that before it wasn't doing it the way you would expect it, and it was not very complete, but you do have full migration system in DataMapper. And it's a bit more, it's a bit different than what you might be used to if you use ActiveRecord. So I'm just going to go through that very quickly. The first type of migration you have is the auto migration. And what happens is when you use DataMapper, you need to define your schema in your model. So you say, for this class, for this object, this attribute will be mapped to the database with this field. Okay, that's pretty simple, and you will give a type. Once you define all these models, what you can do is you can just run auto migrate, and DataMapper would read your models and will create the database for you with all the fields, all the tables you need, everything you need. That's awesome because you can go, if you write your application properly, you can take any type of new developer, you can give them a laptop, and you just say run regdb auto migrate, and they should be up and running. There is no such thing as migration up and down. There's no confusion about, oh, my migration doesn't go up anymore because I changed my model. You don't have that anymore. The second type of migration is called auto update. Auto update is not something you should use in production. Basically, what auto update does is it's trying to compare your models in the current database state, and it will try to make some modifications based on what you have defined. The problem with that is that you're very limited in what you can do. So you cannot, for instance, rename a table, something like that. So it's not something you should really use in production, but it might be useful in development. The last type of migration is the usual ActiveRecord type migration, where you write your migration with all the different steps. And the difference between the ActiveRecord migration and the normal DataMapper migration is that in DataMapper, you should use your migration only once in production. You should never reuse a migration. And basically, the concept is you never migrate down. So when we got this feature in ActiveRecord that you could migrate up and migrate down, we thought it was really cool. But it turns out in production, you never migrate down. And you should really never migrate down. So a migration is just a one-time migration to go from one state to the other, and then you don't reuse it. Now, you don't have to create one migration per change you make in the database and to run all of them. Really, you should have only one migration per deployment. Quickly, custom types. This is a cool feature. I'm not going to go too much into it. Yehuda had a great talk talking about that. What's new since Yehuda's talk is that when you define a property and you put a type, you can have a custom type. And the custom type, what it does is it takes you the string that's passed to it, and it will convert it to an object. And then the other way around, it will take the database object, and well, the database row, and give it back to you as an object. So you can typecast whatever you pass to it and send it back as you want, and you can especially convert it into what you expect. So if the type expects a certain format, but you send a string, it will automatically adapt to the format you want and then put it down in the database, and it will dump it. So a good example of that would be, for instance, if you want to do a CSV type conversion and you don't pass the format that's expected, the custom type will actually reformat what's passed to get something expected, and will just do all the work for you. So that's kind of nice. Something you also need to know about DataMapper is that DataMapper, like Merb, is built on a very modular system where you have a core and you have a bunch of plugins. So DM core is very simple, and then you have a lot of plugins in DM more. Some of them are to handle migration, validation. You have Model Factory that Ben showed earlier with DM Sweatshop. You have a state machine that's built in. You can have constraints if your database would support that. You can have lists, you can have tagging. And because the API is very nice and you have a lot of hooks, you can add your own plugins in a very easy and nice way. The last thing about DataMapper, which I personally think is probably the most, well, okay, I'll say it's just the awesomest thing ever, is query path. That's an example of what you can do with DataMapper, which just wowed me when I realized that. What I want to do in this query is to find all people with an address that has a street, which has street in the street name. So what I would do is just person all, so I get all the person, and then the condition I pass to it is person address is street like, and I put my condition in it. And look at the nice join it does for me. So that's an example using MySQL, and it just does everything in one query, and I don't have to think too much about it. It flows when I write it. And query path will actually understand the associations in an intelligent way. Actually, I just learned while I was preparing this talk, Yehuda came and just told me, well, look, you can even do that. And that's even more awesome. It's just, I mean, I can just look at that like for hours. Right, I'm kind of running off the rough. I don't have much time to keep on talking about that. Just 1 second of silence to look at that and see how awesome it is. I wish I had that before. Wow. All right, so I just want to thank you all the people that helped me putting all of that together. Here are the names of the people. A lot of people, if you have any questions on DataMapper, you can go on RSC. I forgot to mention Carl in this. I know that Carl loves DataMapper, so thank you for your help there, Carl. But all the guys at DataMapper have been really useful. And if you have any questions, just go ahead. Just enjoy.
Can you go back to the SEL section?
Right.
So I understand why, the result that you get is better. I don't understand how DataMapper figures out to do that. Is that something you does DataMapper figure out from that code that it needs to do eager loading, or does it? That's what I'm confused about.
Right. So you want to answer that, Yehuda? Okay. It's okay. You can go ahead. You know better than me.
So what happens is that when you ask for zoo.all, DataMapper remembers that all the zoos are inside of something called a loaded set. And then when you go to do a loop over it, the first time that you ask for an association in a loaded set, it assumes that you actually mean to get, that you're about to do something like this, under the assumption that if you got a whole bunch of objects and then you started to associate some of them, that what you actually meant to do is this. If you didn't mean to do this, then you shouldn't use a loaded set. You should use something else. So,
did that answer your question? Any other questions? Yep. Ryan? We have a question over there. Well, in the meantime, what I didn't say also is that paranoia is built into DataMapper. So if you want to not delete fields, you can do that, or rows, you can do that. That's another awesome aspect of DataMapper.
Just following up on that, so let's say you had that block, the inner block, where multiple lines that were accessing different attributes on the exhibit. Would it have to like reload all of the exhibits, or would it just load everything up right away as soon as you access one attribute on it?
as soon as you access one.
It would just do the same thing, and you'll get with you 2 queries.
Yeah, there's some relationship with lazy loaded attributes also. So if you have a lazy loaded attribute and you ask for that, it also asks for all the other lazy loaded attributes, and there's correct interaction between those things.
Yep. A question there? Wait just for the mic so people can.
Is there any Sphinx integrations that we could ditch AR?
So the question is there any is there any Sphinx implementation so we don't have to use ActiveRecord? I believe thinking Sphinx is handling DataMapper correctly. I don't know if anybody used it yet in the room. Yeah, so somebody's using it. I know Pat, who's working on it, is using DataMapper and Merb, so I'm almost sure it's working. If it's not working, we're going to work on getting it working, no problem.
My question is real quick about versioning.
Right.
So the version numbers between DataMapper and Merb have historically had kind of some issues as they've been live in development up until now. With the release candidate that's coming out with 1.0, is this a joint release in terms of versions, or are these two things going to stay separate on their own tracks?
So that's a very good question. So we have 2 different teams working on DataMapper and Merb. We're going to release 1.0 with a fixed version of DataMapper, but they're not going to stay in sync. But we're gonna actually put a specific dependency, because we're gonna test it with one version of DataMapper and say we validate if you want to use DataMapper with the stack. So it's up to you to change that. But if you want to use Merb, stack, and DataMapper, that's gonna be the dependency that we recommend, and we're gonna put by default in the stack.
Yeah, I had a question. So Ray, or ActiveRecord, I should say, does this really ugly column aliasing. They do like, if you want to say, select name from user, it does like select name as T1_R0 or something really ugly. How does DataMapper handle that kind of stuff?
Well, I just show you the awesome slide, and you will see how he does it. Where's the awesome slide? I should have a shortcut. Just go there. There you go. Does that answer your question? Doesn't need to.
Just simpler to write the code.
That prompts another question. If you had an object which had a how's this work? Has another object, and both of them have addresses on both of them, would it start doing table aliasing automatically to be able to reference with them?
I'm not sure. Yehuda, do you know that? Yeah, it would do some sort of renaming, but not the T1 craziness. Yeah, to take the mic.
So one of the reasons that ActiveRecord has to do crazy things like that is because ActiveRecord builds strings as it goes. So if you have a query and ActiveRecord does what it does, it's not building up an object that it can introspect later and figure out how to make a query. It's just making a bunch of strings. So they have to figure out a hack that lets them not have to really know very much as they build the query. With DataMapper, you get a big object. The adapter gets an object that basically tells it there's these relationships, and here's how they're linked together. And the adapter is able to then look at it and figure out the most efficient way to do it. So if you ever wrote real SQL, you would know that it is not necessary to write like as T1 dot blah blah. That isn't actually necessary. It's just that it's simpler if you're doing the non-ORM-ish thing that ActiveRecord is doing to do that. Did that not make any sense to you?
Well, I was just saying that you're using when you go to do it, you would actually have two references to the same table. You'd have to use aliases.
Right.
At that
So when you get down into like crazy cases, then yes, I'm sure there's something, but I'm sure it's not but it's not by default. Every single thing has to have T1 dot.
For simpler joints, you don't
Gotcha.
need that.
I know for sure it's handled because I've had cases like that, so I know it somehow works.
One more question.
Hi, I just had a quick question about if you have a set of data on a production server using DataMapper,
Right.
and you, for instance, want to rename a column,
Right.
that you then want to apply that sort of migration to, let's say, 4 or 5 different servers, and you want to rename that column on all 5 servers, how would you do that using DataMapper?
Just a simple migration.
The only philosophical difference with production migrations really between ActiveRecord and DataMapper is that DataMapper doesn't really see migrations as like an artifact that sticks around for a long time. It sees migrations as a script you're going to run on the server when you deploy, and then after that, it's pretty much, that's it.
So you can use, there's actually like a change table syntax where you can...
Oh yeah, it's exactly the same syntax.
Not exactly the same.
Well, no, but what I mean is you can do what you do in a normal migration, right?
The point is that the way developer mode works with ActiveRecord in general is that people use migrations to get their developers up and running. Auto migrations basically short circuits that for new developers, so you don't have to worry about making sure your back migrations forever on in the past still work with your current code. Just
Thank you.
auto migrate, you're done.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
I have a quick follow-up on that. How does that relate to rolling back code if you do a database migration?
You can use transactions.
Do you mean rolling back like at some point in the future, like, oh, I realized I made a mistake in my migrations?
No, it's more you do a deployment and you realize that that version's broken and you need to go back one.
Yeah, so there's some support in DataMapper migrations for rollback, for like down migrations, but I've done reasonably big apps, and I don't think it's ever really been a real option to, after like a app is deployed and people already start using the new code, to roll back, because then you have to figure out how to, like, you have to spend some time figuring out how to convert the stuff that people put in the new schema backwards, and usually like figuring out how to fix the problem is better. But maybe other people have other experiences. I just haven't really experienced down migrations being very useful.
You can do it. It's built into DataMapper. It's just not a recommended practice. Okay.
So one of the things you mentioned was that auto-migrate can read all your models and create the entire database schema. What about things like models that need indexes?
Do you know? I do it manually.
I think there actually is a syntax for specifying an index on a property. You're getting to there's a whole bunch of stuff I would like to do in my database, and doing auto migration is going to be tricky. I think the plan is to make the properties robust enough to be able to represent most things that you would have in your database, and auto migrations would work. I don't know to what extent that is done. I think indexes are something that you can actually specify in your model.
Okay.
I'm sorry? Yeah.
So the answer is basically you can specify some sort of indexing, but you cannot do everything you could imagine inside the model.
But it's definitely something that should eventually be there.
Yeah, that's something that should be there. Will probably be there soon. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody.